Mayhew, and I'm going to be covering the 2015 Paris Agreement. Climate change is one of the most contentious issues in modern day history as it affects all of us, and we have to work together in order to address it. So, what exactly is the Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement is a multilateral climate change agreement that was negotiated and agreed upon at the 21st Conference of the Parties in 2015. The Conference of the Parties, or COP, refers to the countries that signed up to the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC for short. The Paris Agreement was the first global accord to contain policies for all countries to follow, and it replaced the Kyoto Protocol largely because the United States and China chose not to participate in the Kyoto Protocol, which rendered the protocol largely ineffective. While the Paris Agreement leaves the domestic policy to individual countries through nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, it also provides international obligations to enforce and strengthen policy with an emphasis on ambition every 5 years. Because climate change is a hotly contended issue, with many fingers being pointed and some outright denying its existence, it is a miracle that the Paris Agreement was ratified by 190 countries, including the United States and China, two of the world's biggest polluters and also perhaps the countries with the most seemingly irreconcilable differences between one another. So, what are the specific goals of the Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement aims to hold the increase in average global temperature to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, and also to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C above those pre-industrial levels. The goal for emissions is to reach a net zero by the second half of the 21st century and to peak emissions by 2030. So now I'm going to talk about the specific parts of the Paris Agreement that address climate change. The first part of the Paris Agreement refers to mitigation of emissions, which basically means to reduce emissions and to stabilize the levels of heat-trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This relates to the net zero goal of the second half of the 21st century that I mentioned earlier. So what exactly does net zero mean? Net zero means that greenhouse gases emissions, like carbon dioxide and methane that are being released in the atmosphere currently due to human activity, those emissions should be counterbalanced and also reduced. So there's two parts. There's reduction of greenhouse gases overall, and then there's also the removal or the green part of the GIF that you're seeing on the screen. The first part is reducing the sources of greenhouse gases emissions to as close to zero as possible. Mitigation is a broad topic that spans throughout entire sectors of countries, including agriculture, forests, transportation, infrastructure, and energy. This shift is more complicated than it initially appears because climate change and the reduction of it must involve a careful touch because there are many workers who work in the heaviest carbon emitting sectors that will be affected if policy is not made to mitigate the reduction of greenhouse gases. Now, the second part of mitigation involves balancing the remaining greenhouse gases inevitably left over after a general reduction of the greenhouse gases. The balancing happens with carbon sinks or carbon renewal, which takes place with action like the restoration of forests. Carbon sinks absorb more greenhouse gases than they produce, hence why they are called sinks. It is important to note that net zero should always refer to all greenhouse gases and go beyond just a net zero goal only for carbon dioxide. Now, the second part of the Paris Agreement refers to adaptation to climate change, which specifically means acknowledging that some aspects of climate change, like the fires and drought that we are currently experiencing right here in California, and the increase in severity of hurricanes, as well as the rise in sea level, it's the acknowledgement that those things are already happening and they will get worse. Specifically, urban areas are the most at risk because of the sheer amount of people affected. Thus, one implementation of adaptation could look like investing in infrastructure to protect people from instances such as increased flooding within their communities. Because people can physically see this part of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, policy is slightly easier to enact because it directly impacts communities in a very close form, which is very applicable to individuals. The third part of the climate agreement refers to finance, which is a key aspect of climate change because economics impacts the way things work and the way solutions arise. Climate finance specifically refers to supporting the effort of the first two parts of the Paris Agreement, the mitigation and the adaptation. The Paris Agreement outlines a stream of money that is to flow from more developed countries to poorer ones. Specifically, the agreement requires a flow of $100 billion US a year by 2020, with the sum to be revisited in 2025. However, this funding is not quite happening and it is difficult to track as well. But now that we are in 2021, the question remains as to whether countries are doing enough to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement from nearly 6 years ago. Problematically, in 2019, for the COP25th event, the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, that I mentioned earlier, of all of the nations together, they fall well short of what is needed to achieve part of the Paris Agreement, which is the 2 degrees Celsius. And even grimmer news, according to the United Nations Environment Program report from 2019, there's no sign of greenhouse gas emissions peaking in the next few years. And problematically, later peaking of emissions means that deeper and faster cuts are required to meet the targets. Each country has its own challenges to face in order to make the goals. The world's largest emitter, China, announced that last September that the country's emissions would peak at 2030 and that by 2060 China would become carbon neutral. Note that this does not speak to overall climate neutrality. Even carbon neutrality, though, has its difficulties because nearly 60% of China's energy comes from coal, which is a notorious pollutant. However, China has incentive in that they are affected as a country by rising sea levels, as the most agriculture comes from the coast. The United States, on the other hand, as the second largest emitter after China, had its own challenges with the Paris Agreement, particularly when President Trump announced that America would withdraw from the Paris Agreement as soon as possible. Thus, in 2019, the U.S. withdrew from the accord, but then hours after taking the oath of office, President Biden initiated the process back into the agreement and has made addressing climate change a key part of his presidency. In recent news as well, the two countries, China and America, recently released a joint statement committing to collaboration on reducing climate change and strengthening implementation of the Paris Agreement. Both countries aim to continue discussion on key elements towards their goals of carbon neutrality, and by COP26, they plan to release their long-term strategies for carbon neutrality. Overall, there is much work to be done with regards to meeting targets for the Paris Agreement for climate change and neutrality with greenhouse emissions. This is because climate change is perhaps one of the most daunting tasks our globe faces. However, it is a necessary first step to acknowledge that climate change even exists. Now it is the time for countries to make good on their promises and so we can put an end to climate change. Thank you.